Hey YouTubers, it's me, Lonnie Clark, Nuts for Art, Beyond Extinction Love. I'm going to read another little chapter of our book, Black Like Me by John Howard Griffin. We're on page 149, and if you recall right, he got an invitation to go out to California to Paul Coates' show. I think that was called Confidential Files. It was a very popular investigative story in the early television years. Everybody watched it. So we're on March 14th. That's where we ended, March 14th. The first of Coates' show was televised locally after it had been given heavy publicity over the weekend by the newspapers. I think almost every TV viewer in the area watched the show. When the program was finished and we heard Paul Coates announce that we would return tomorrow to continue the interview, our attention switched to the telephone. We realized that now our neighbors knew. Now the whole Dallas-Fort Worth area knew. The phone began to ring. I picked it up, wondering what I should say if it were an abusive call. It was Penn and L.A. Jones from Midlothian. They talked for a long time. I realized that they were tying up the line so that no hate calls could come through. Finally, after almost an hour, we said goodbye. Immediately, my parents called to say it was fine. How full of dread their voices were, but they sincerely approved of what I had said. After that, silence. We sat and waited, but the phone did not ring. The silence was so unnatural, so ominous, it weighed heavy on us. Were none of my friends, no members of my family going to call? March 17th. Flew to New York 2 days ago. Interview this morning with Time magazine in their new offices. They took photos and treated me with great cordiality. While I was at Time, the Dave Garrow show called. We were to have a preliminary interview that afternoon at 5. Unable to bear the silence from home, I returned to my room and telephoned to Mansfield. As a result of the 2 Paul Coates shows, my mother had received the first threatening phone call. It was from a woman who would not identify herself. The conversation had begun politely enough. The woman said that they could not understand in town how I could turn against my own race. My mother assured her that I had done this precisely for my race. The woman said, "Why, he's just thrown the door wide open for those niggers. And after we've all worked so hard to keep them out." Oh my God. Then she became abusive and succeeded in terrorizing my mother by telling her, if you could just hear what they're planning to do to him if he ever comes back to Mansfield." "Who's planning?" my mother asked. "That's all right. You just ought to be over here at Curry's, a local cafe and a night spot on the highway leading into Mansfield, run by ardent segregationists. You'd see to it he'd never show his face in Mansfield again." My mother said she'd felt better when I talked to her. She had never been confronted with this sort of brutality before. She called my wife over and they sat together, frightened. Then they called Penn Jones, who came immediately and placed himself at their disposition. Sickened that they would pick on a man's mother and strike at him through terrorizing her, I immediately made calls and asked for police surveillance of both my home and my parents' home. March 18th. Garraway was immensely impressed. When we finally met this morning, briefly, before I went on camera, I told him that I was afraid my appearance would bring severe repercussions against him from the South. He stood large, much larger than he appeared on the screen. I told him I would answer his questions as carefully as possible. He bent over and said, "Mr. Griffin, John, let me ask you to do one thing." I braced myself against his request, fearing he would ask me to go soft pedal. "Just tell the truth as honestly and as frankly as you can, and don't worry about my sponsors or anything else. You keep your mind clear to answer whatever I ask. Will you forget everything else and just remember that? I looked at him with a surgence of faith in the public figure. He had me on camera 20 minutes, and he asked pointed questions that he did not evade the issue. Before the interview was over, we were both deeply moved. At the end, he asked me about discrimination in the North. I told him I was not competent to answer. I told him that the Southern racists invariably brought up the point that things aren't perfect in the North either, which is no doubt so, as though that fact justified his injustices in the South. March 23rd. It was a busy weekend. I spent more and more time in my room between interviews and conferences with Mr. Leviathan and our PR man, Ben Hall, while Mr. Leviathan had a constant stream of visitors in his suite. On Tuesday, I did a TV documentary with Harry Golden. The Mike Wallace show went on that evening, and then a long radio interview on the Long John show from midnight until 4:30 in the morning. I got no sleep. Ben Hall offered me tranquilizers, but I did not dare take one for fear it would put me out completely. The Time article would be out that evening. I was anxious to see how they would treat the story, but I was most nervous about the Mike Wallace show and told Ben Hall that if Mike asked just one wrong question, I would get up and walk out. He assured me Wallace would be sympathetic, but I had strong reservations. I particularly feared he would get embroiled in a religious discussion, bring in my Roman Catholicism in a way that would embarrass the church. The Golden Show went all right. It was easy, with the director taking pains to keep it informal and encourage me. I got off to a bad start, but we did it over and it came out all right. Then in the evening, Ben Hall came to pick me up. We took a taxi to Mike Wallace's office, stopping at the corner of Broadway and 14th to pick up a copy of Time. It was around 8 o'clock, and the streets were wet under a drizzling rain. Ben left me in a cigar stand and ran across the street to get the magazine. In a moment, he returned with 2 copies. The story was good. They had told it right and straight. Relieved, we walked to Wallace's office. When they showed us in, Wallace rose from his chair behind the desk and shook hands. I was surprised to find him so much more youthful in appearance than I had imagined, but he looked so tired and uncomfortable. He offered me a seat and without pretense asked if I wanted to see the questions he planned to ask me. I told him no. He appeared to know that I viewed him cautiously and that I was not enthusiastic about this interview. He fumbled uncomfortably for words, and I took a liking to him. From the hints he dropped, "We've investigated you pretty thoroughly," I was aghast. He knew things about the trip, the names of people I had stayed with, many things I had tried to hide in order to protect the people involved. "Please," I pleaded, "don't mention those names on the air. I'd be afraid their lives would be endangered, and they're my friends." "Hell, I'm not going to do a damn thing to hurt them," he said. "Look, I'm on your side." "How did you find out about all of this?" I asked. "Oh, it's part of the business," he said. We sat in his office, both of us dull, both of us tired to death. Our talk frittered out. He asked how the Coates shows went when he heard they were excellent. "That makes me want to do better," he said. "I had a full hour. You've only got a half an hour," I said. He pulled a bottle of whiskey out of his desk and offered me a drink. I refused. "Look, John, hell, I know you've done nothing but answer questions on all these shows and newspaper interviews, but will you pull yourself together and really work for me tonight?" "I do that as a matter of conscience anyways," I said. "I want you to tell me something," he said. I'm scared to death of you. I mean, a man who'd do what you've done? Then you don't know me as well as I thought you did, I said. The truth is, I'm scared of you. He burst out laughing. Well, I guarantee you've got no reason to be. Liveliness returned. Both of us felt certain it would go well. We walked out onto the stage that contained only 2 chairs and a smoking stand. The camera technicians and directors prepared us, got cables out of sight, strapped mics to our necks, and shouted instructions. Wallace smoked incessantly and smiled at me while yelling oaths in answer to yelled instructions. Remember, he said, we've got to do as well in a half an hour as you did with Paul in an hour. I'll talk fast, I said, peering past the lights into the camera jumble of darkness. The count started. The red lights came on. Wallace talked and smoked. He poured intelligent questions into me, and I kept his face close, absorbing my attention, encouraging me. It was a supercharged moment. I answered, forgetting everything except him and his questions. Fatigue disappeared. Fascination took over. The excitement sustained us. I realized when the time was up that it had gone well. And when we went off the air, Wallace shouted, "Top notch! Cancel everything and schedule it immediately." It was an extraordinary experience. Never have I been handled more superbly by an interviewer. April 1. Radio television franchise flew a crew of 5 from Paris to do a television show, person-to-person type, at my home in Mansfield. We had 3 busy days with Pierre Dumaillet, the commentator, and Claude Lourcade, the director of Cinq Colonnes d'Aune. I put them on the plane out here yesterday evening, and only then had time to settle down to do some work. But work was difficult. The story had circulated all over the world, and mail, telegrams, and phone calls poured in. The local situation was odd. I had no contact with anyone in town, and no one had contact with me. However, I understood that I was loudly discussed in the stores and on the streets, that the druggist and a couple of others had risen to my defense when the discussions became hot. I avoided going downtown, going into any of the stores, for fear of my presence would embarrass the people who had been my friends. The local roadside cafe, a gathering place for segregationists, had a new sign. For some time, it carried a sign reading, "We don't serve niggers." Then it was replaced by a larger sign, "Whites only." Now another had joined it, "No albinos allowed." This sign that so disgusted my parents greatly amused me. I was surprised and pleased to discover that Foy Curry, the cafe owner, was after all a man of some wit. The principal point of contention among the women of the town appeared to be whether or not I had done a Christian thing. I feel that though a few of them liked it, at least a large portion of them understood that I had worked for them and their children as I did for the Negroes. Certainly, my mail thus far was overwhelmingly congratulatory. I began to hope that I had been overly pessimistic, that we might be able to live in Mansfield in an atmosphere of peace and understanding after all. April 2. The phone woke me in the morning. I glanced out our front window to the calm spring landscape of fields and woods, then picked up the phone. A long-distance call from the Star Telegram in Fort Worth. What could they want? I wondered, since they had not carried one word about my story. The reporter came on the line. He cautiously asked me how things were. "All right as far as I know," I said. You don't sound too excited, he said. I began to feel uneasy. Why should I be? You mean you haven't heard? What? You were hanged in effigy from the center of the red light. You were hanged in effigy from the center red light wire downtown on Main Street this morning. In Mansfield? I asked. That's right. He told me that the Star-Telegram had received an anonymous call that racists had hanged my effigy on Main Street. The newspaper checked it out with a local constable who confirmed that a dummy, half black, half white, with my name on it and a yellow streak painted down its back was hanging from a wire. What would you like to say about that? The reporter asked. I'm sorry it happened, I said. It'll only give the town a worse name. People seem pretty excited about what you've done. There's a lot of loose talk out in Mansfield. Do you think this represents a real threat? I'd probably be the last to know, I said. Do you think your life's in danger? I have no idea. What are you going to do about this hanging? Ignore it. You're not even going downtown to see it? No, this sort of thing is not interesting, I said. Do you think it represents the prevailing sentiment around town? No, I'm sure it doesn't. The reporter thanked me for my answers. He said they had sent a photographer out to take a picture of the effigy. The reporter called back. He wondered, as I did, how this could have happened on Main Street when we were supposed to have police on duty all night. He told me that a grocer saw the effigy around 5 a.m. when he came to work, then called the constable and told him to get that damn thing down from there. The constable had taken it down and thrown it into a town junk heap, but when the reporter and the photographer got to Mansfield, someone had retrieved the effigy from the dump and hung on it a sign reading, $25 fine for dumping dead animals. The locals remained utterly silent. I waited for anyone, to call and say, we may not approve of your views, but we think this hanging is shameful. Their silence was eloquent and devastating. My disappointment grew as the afternoon passed. Did their silence condone the lynching? My family's uneasiness approached terror now. My parents and my wife's mother begged us to take the children and go away somewhere till this whole thing blew over. That evening, the Star-Telegram carried a 6-column banner front page headline announcing the lynching effigy. Margaret Ann Turner, Mrs. Dershot Turner, had heard the news on TV and called from Dallas to say that they were coming after the children. We telephoned the Joneses in Mid-Lython and then called the Turners back. Dershot said that we must come and stay with him as long as there was even the slightest danger. The Joneses also invited us, but they felt it might be better if we were in Dallas, since I had much more support there, according to them. At such times, the slightest kindness on the part of anyone becomes sort of a bravery. My dad, who had gone to town defiantly, I imagine, returned almost jubilant. He had gone to the grocery store where he usually trades and heard the sudden silence. Then one of the owners in the back of the meat counter called a greeting. I didn't know whether I was still welcome, Dad said. Hell, you know better than that, the grocer shouted. I don't know. The way people have been acting, I was afraid that if they saw me coming into your store, they might stop trading here. That's the kind of customer we don't want in the first place, the grocer said. In the context of the day, this was heroism. Someone in town dared to express an opinion. The time came to take my wife and children to Dallas. Dershot Turner had called again and told me to bring my typewriter and current work. We fixed you up an office here in the Bridwell Library, he said, referring to the library of the Southern Methodist University Perkins School of Theology. I'm not going to do it. Somebody's sure to find out, and then they'll squawk about the HMU offering me protection. I'm too unpopular. I don't want to get you or them in any uncomfortable situation. He insisted. He said they would be honored to offer me any hospitality and library or research facilities. They even requested that I lecture to the student body. On my way out of the lane that leads from my parents' place to my home, the neighbors at the halfway point waved, but those near the highway, people with whom we had been cordial, gave me the most violently hostile stare. I ran the gauntlet driving through town. At the second red light, a truck pulled up beside me, and a young man in a cowboy hat looked down into the cab of my car. He told me that he'd heard that they were planning to come and castrate me, that the date had been set. He said this coldly, without emotion, neither threatening nor sympathetic, exactly the way one would say, the weatherman's promising rain for tomorrow. I stared up at him, not recognizing him, and felt my face flush with the embarrassment of being a public spectacle. After he drove on, I felt sure he meant to imply that someone from out of town, not a local group, planned this. When I got home, the suitcases were packed. My wife's mother said people in town thought the effigy was the work of outsiders. I told her I had no way of knowing, but would certainly like to believe it. I'm going to end here. We're at 21 minutes. We're on page 157. We're going to start again on April 7th. Dang, man, people are so insecure. I just do not understand white supremacy. It's beyond comprehension how hateful people are just over skin color. It's just astounding to me. Anyways, you guys, put your courage feet on. I'll see you again tomorrow morning. I'm starting to read in the morning. I think that is a better idea, at least for me. Because then I can just work as late as I need to and not have to worry about posting. So, talk to you guys again tomorrow. Ciao.